Okay, friends, so welcome to another week of fairy tales. There are two main things that I want to talk about this week, and they do overlap. The first thing is, well, not the first thing, but one thing is that we're going to talk about the classification of folk tales and fairy tales. We saw that with Vladimir Prop and others. The second thing we're going to talk about is the dynamics of gender in fairy tales, because we see gender at play in the performance of fairy tales, that is, who tells them, right? The collection and publishing of fairy tales, generally male editors, men in general, and in the tales themselves, because of the characters and the choices available to those characters based on their gender, and the outcome of those choices is also very gendered. So we have to remember, again, that fairy tales dramatize cultural values. They present us with characters making choices based on the information and avenues available to them, and allow us to think about the choices that we would make. Um, the way that this intersects with the Vladimir Prop and the morphology of the folktale, one of the ways, is that I hope that we can start to shift, that you can start to shift from seeing fairy tale characters as people and start to see them as archetypal characters and as types that function in different ways within the plot. So they represent archetypes, they represent these sort of larger stock character types, and we see how they function. So we don't necessarily think about Cinderella as an individual with inner thoughts and feelings. We rather think of Cinderella as a character who functions in a specific way in specific kinds of plots. So we see the archetypes that they represent, we see the cultural anxieties that these characters embody, and the values that they enact in their stories. So let's think first about gender dynamics within fairy tales, because Tatar gives us such a great overview of some of the ways in which violence in particular is gendered in fairy tales, and in which villainy and cruelty is gendered. Because she points out everyone in fairy tales is capable of cruelty, but we see very specific kinds of cruelty from female villains, from mothers, stepmothers, and enchantresses and witches. Book, Sex and Violence, The Hard Facts of the Grimm's Fairy Tales, in her book that excerpt that we read for this week is taken from, Tatar delves much more deeply into the female villains, the female cruelty in the Grimm's tales. And so she gives us an overview of three different types of ogres in the tales. The first are beasts and monsters, so wolves, bears, giants. Then there's the social deviants like robbers and highwaymen, etc. And then finally, there are women, just generally. And Tatar writes, this group easily outnumbers the members of both other categories, and it's composed of women. So, and I'm going to read to you here. These are the various cooks, stepmothers, witches, and mothers-in-law with voracious appetites for human fare, sometimes even for the flesh and blood, or for the liver and heart of their own relatives. One of the things that we see with these women, we see a lot of maternal malice. So we see a lot of malice and evil and plotting and hatred, and cruelty and torture coming from these maternal figures, usually a stepmother. Even if it wasn't a stepmother in the oral collection of the tale, the Grimms often changed it to a stepmother because the idea of a cruel mother or a mother who visited these things upon her own children was so outside of what they wanted to consider and outside of what they wanted in the nursery and in the household. And so these facets of maternal evil in the fairy tales, they're sort of the opposite of all of the positive qualities that are associated with mothers. So where mothers are seen as nurturers and providers, these stepmothers, these female villains, they starve and they starve the children and thrust them out into the cold. We see that in Hansel and Gretel, we see it in Cinderella, and lots of variants on that with Snow White and Rose Red, or Briar something, Mother Holly, old Mother Holly. And even beyond that, taken to an extreme, instead of nurturing and providing for the children, these villains like the witch in Hansel and Gretel, the Wicked Queen in Snow White, they want to eat and nourish themselves with the bodies of these children. In Tatar's work with the Grimm's fairy tales, she's also seen, like I said, that whereas in the oral tellings of these fairy tales, a lot of the times the villains are witches or enchantresses, mothers. The Grimm's brothers, they did not like that. They did not want to have biological mothers behaving this way, and so they shift it. They shift that burden of evil from a mother to a stepmother, and so that's why we have that archetype that is so prevalent and so popular culturally of the wicked stepmother. So since we're talking about functions and classifications in fairy tales, let's take a look at some of the ways in which female villains function in fairy tales. Tatar points out that there are three main functions that they serve in the plot of a fairy tale, and those are chronological. So the first function that we have the female villains serving as is in the home. Okay, they terrorize the protagonist in the home so much that they create an atmosphere of brutality and cruelty, so much so that the protagonist either is driven from the home, is exiled from the home by the stepmother or by the cook or whoever, whoever's the stand-in for the stepmother there, is exiled from the home and has to go out, right? Or is driven from the home in that it becomes an unbearable situation and the protagonist runs away. The second function comes when the protagonist is out in the forest or wherever, that sort of intermediary liminal space might be where a lot of the magic and enchantment of the fairy tales takes place. And there, they often meet female villains who are armed with supernatural powers. So that's where we tend to see a lot of the witches, the enchantresses, the ogresses, that kind of thing. And I'll read you this because I love it. The villainous stepmother reemerges in the woods as a monster, equipped with powers far more formidable than those she exercised at home. So because she's a witch, because she's an enchantress, the cruel things that a stepmother could do at home are just magnified exponentially because she's a superhuman opponent with supernatural powers to inflict them. Often at this stage as well, the stepbrother or the stepson is enchanted in some way, and it falls to the stepdaughter to break that enchantment. So it's, for example, it's Hansel who's locked in the cage and being fattened up to be eaten, and Gretel who has to figure out a way to break that and free Hansel. Or it's, little brother who drinks from the stream that's been enchanted by the witch and turns into a deer, and it's up to the sister to figure out how to break that spell. Finally, when our protagonists, usually our female protagonists, move into the third stage of the tale, sort of the resolution where they create a new home and this new sphere of action, that they move to creating the new nuclear family or rebuilding the nuclear family. This is where the female villain has to be punished, right? So the before anyone can live happily ever after, we have to stop this cycle of violence and the interference of the violent and cruel female villain. And so once the female protagonist is able to, reverse the effects of her stepmother's machinations, let's say, the stepmother, the female villain, has to be punished, and often in very violent ways, as we've seen. As for fathers, they tend to have disappeared in the Grimm's versions of these tales, largely because when they do occupy roles, in the oral tellings and the collection of them, it tended to be very difficult subjects to deal with, incest and things that actually do happen and do plague and terrorize girls and young women. And so because it's so close to real life, as Tatar points it out, it becomes much less palatable in the narratives. And so we see father figures largely disappearing, whether by censure from the Grimms or, just sort of a shift in cultural taste. And so, we have these bad mothers, and sometimes the good mothers, but the good mothers are usually dead or otherwise absent. I encourage you, if you're interested, to dive more deeply into that as we approach the fairy tale essay, because I certainly find female villains and particularly the idea of maternal malice and absolving the biological parents of any wrongdoing and instead sort of enshrining the wicked stepmother as this cultural archetype, as the doer of evil. It's very interesting to me. So Maria Tatar's book, The Hard Facts of the Grimm's Fairy Tales, is a great place to start, but there's certainly others if you want to ask for my recommendations. With that brief exploration of the functioning of female villains in tales, again, we're moving more towards archetypal thinking and away from thinking of them as individual people with thoughts and feelings and motives and desires. Because in fairy tales, again, to repeat, what we see is a physicalization of the inner workings of the mind. So we don't have a lot of inner life. We just have these sort of outward manifestations of an inner life. So, okay, Vladimir Propp, he's very important in the study of folktales, fairy tales. You know, his Morphology of the Folktale is a very influential text, along with the Arne Thompson, the ATU, right, the tale types. His Propp's classification of the motifs and Stith Thompson's classification of the tale types. These are helpful ways for us to think about fairy tales because they allow us to create a context in which to sort of compare tales and see which motifs are stable and which motifs are varying in different versions. So Vladimir Propp was one of these people who, and you can see this, I think, in the reading. There was this real anxiety about folklore as a discipline being seen as not a real discipline or as a soft study, you know, something soft to study, and not, you know, not having the respectability that the sciences did. So a lot of theorists around this time were working on giving that respectability to folklore by and other kinds of literary study by having these sort of scientific methods and classification, you know, morphology, taxonomy. These are ways to, you know, sort of shore up the credibility of the discipline, according to them. So I appreciate that Propp brought to our attention the ways that literature is stable, right? We have the interplay between the reader and the author, but there's no interaction, right? It's not like the reaction of the reader changes the literary text in any way once it's written down, right? There might be future versions or whatever, or for future editions, but in general, you know, when you read the book, you read the same book over and over, and the person reading, the reader, changes, but the text itself does not. And in folklore, however, we have variation, right? Like that's the whole thing about folklore, and Propp articulates particularly well that, you know, as tastes change, so will the telling of these oral narratives. With folklore, we have two interactive agents, right? We have the audience and we have the teller, and anybody in the audience can later become a teller, and so these performers, you know, there's these shifting roles of performers, as well as, you know, each performer adapting it for themselves, and the audience's reactions feeding the way that the performance is enacted. So, you know, while Propp is very concerned with drawing a line between literature and folklore, I'm less concerned with us drawing like this distinct red line between literature and folklore. But it is true that once something starts to circulate and vary in that circulation, right? We have variations and versions in that circulation. That's when folklorists really become interested in it. We become interested in how literary texts are, you know, sort of adapted into folk culture and circulated, and we're interested in how folk motifs and folklore are taken up in literary texts. So, in the way that Propp has, you know, classified these motifs and the different functions, it's useful up to a point. As I said, it's useful because we can look at the motifs that are occurring within a version of a story and see what other meanings and resonances they might have because of their use in other tales and their use throughout that culture. But we also need to remember that the story is its own context. So it's really interesting to go out and do that kind of comparative research, but we also have to restrict ourselves sometimes, you know, even within the same research project, but we have to spend some time looking specifically at the text and analyzing the motifs as they appear in the text and taking the story as its own context. Because after all, there are drawbacks to this kind of morphological study, this kind of taxonomy and classification. For one thing, it's reductive, and it flattens the tales and tends to sometimes even take them out of their cultural context. And of course, we've talked about how context is where the meaning of folklore is, you know, arises. It tends to be universalizing. So, you know, we can't look at the same motif occurring in a tale from China as we can in a tale being told in Germany. We can't look at those motifs the same way because they have very different cultural contexts. We don't want to universalize a single motif. We don't want to say that bears mean the same thing in every culture, for example. It also ignores the context of performance and the way that that a teller will, you know, imbue the tale with their own individuality and their own ideas. And finally, it's imposing these outside definitions. So we talk about etic versus emic definitions, and the emic definitions are the ones that are from the group, and the etic definitions are the ones that are imposed on them by scholars. So we want to always consider how those within the folk group would explain and classify and make meaning out of their own folklore, rather than always saying like, well, this is the meaning and this is how I've classified them, and therefore this tale is of this type and of this function. So as we move forward, I encourage you to think pretty clearly about gender and how gender is at play within the fairy tales, as well as thinking about how different motifs are functioning within the tale and how they resonate larger in a larger cultural context. And finally, the thing I want us to think about is the way in which literature is sort of encoded as male, where folklore is sort of encoded as female, in terms of who can perform it and who can create it. And it's, interesting that in a folklore setting where we sort of popularly conceive of it as being not having a single author, not having a single creator, but being the work of a group, that is often the provenance of women. Whereas in literature, where we think of it as having a single author and we have the sort of model of the creative genius or whatever, that's thought of being the provenance of men, particularly in these specific contexts. But so we see a sort of trivializing of women's creativity and women's work, and valorizing of the same kind of work in men, and attributing it to the individual. Whereas with women, we say, oh well, it's the group. It's a natural thing that they do. They've had it from someone else, that kind of thing. So we'll look more at that next week and moving forward. But as you start to think about how you want to analyze a particular tale and what version you're going to focus on, those are things to think about. So yeah, I'll see you next week.